David Ernsberger, Senior Editorial Director, Asia, Platts. Thank you for this interview.
No problem at all.
Let's talk about tonight's event, Top 250 Global Energy Companies event.
Sure. Well, for the past 7 years, we've been producing this survey of companies to help people understand who in the energy industry around the world is doing well from year to year, and particularly to sort of shed some light on the very complicated balance between, revenues, your balance sheet, your net profit, your return on investment, because all of these things are important to how a company is doing, and essentially the value is given to shareholders. But it's very difficult to maybe measure them all because nobody's putting them together into a concise, homogenized list. So we're taking companies from about 100 countries around the world, and we're trying to sort of standardize the way you can measure their performance and understand who's really doing well. Now, in the 7 years we've been doing this, the markets have been through some very turbulent times. Energy prices rallied to historic highs, and then of course they fell by 50% in just 3 months. So really now more than ever, people need to know who's doing well.
Okay. What does Platts hope to achieve with this event?
Well, the most important thing for us is to really provide a standard, provide a benchmark for companies to know how they're doing. So what we would really like to try and achieve is bring these companies together and talk about what it is to be successful, how you can measure your success, and maybe establish some of these best practices to help companies be successful going forward, particularly here in Asia, because there's no single governing body that really brings together these kinds of ideas. Everyone is working under a different national set of standards. Everybody's working with different government regulations in place, and just the chance to get people together from so many different countries and talk about where success has been achieved is, I think, an opportunity in itself to really bring some value, maybe.
Platts will be handing out various awards to winners today. Can you tell us more about these categories and what criteria must these companies meet before they are awarded?
Well, we have a couple of different categories that we're looking at this year. Basically, putting those four things together, net profit, revenue, return on investment, and asset value, looking at which companies in each sector of the industry has been the most successful in the past year. We have one for integrated oil company, we have one for gas utility, we have one for power utility, we have one for diversified utility, and looking at the companies in each of those areas to decide which ones have been the most successful in the past year. And they're measured on those four things put together.
I see. Who are some of tonight's winners?
Well, tonight, the top two companies overall for Asia are PetroChina and Sinopec. Now, those two companies have really blazed the trail for a lot of the companies that are winning awards in other categories tonight. They've just been the most successful for the past 3 years, clearly, in Asia at bringing those four elements together of a successful business. They're far ahead of the pack, and PetroChina actually is number one here in Asia for a third year in a row. But we're looking at other categories as well, including fastest growing, and there's a couple of companies in there that really stand out this year. Bharat Petroleum from India, IOC, ONGC. The Indian companies are really coming up quickly, and it's a little bit like the economies as well. India is beginning to come into the fore, and some of the companies from that country are also beginning to move up that list. And we're looking at some of those companies as well tonight.
Okay. Tonight's event aside, how would you describe the mood of the oil traders today, given the volatility of the oil markets and financial crisis?
Well, like you guys, I'm sure I've been out in the industry both here and, as you say, apart from tonight, and the mood is pretty somber, I have to say. There's a pretty big freeze going on in the industry right now. There have been some substantial shocks that have been felt in the community, whether it's trading or it's refining or it's upstream. The fall of energy prices by 50% in just 4 months has been a massive shock. The credit meltdown in the U.S. and the availability of credit to do trading has stopped activity to almost a standstill. So the mood is pretty glum, I have to say. Refining margins are coming down. Upstream companies have got some pretty bad hedges on their hands now. But this is a very important time to come together and also talk about who's going to survive the next year or two and who's going to emerge as a potential leader in the next 10 years.
Okay, last question. Do you see any positives for the oil industry emerging from the credit and financial crisis?
I think so. Among other things, I think there's been a general lack of understanding about risk management. That's been something that's troubled the oil industry and the energy industry for as long as I can remember. At least 20 or 30 years. Energy risk management has been very poorly understood. And I think that this volatility that we've seen and the crash in prices for the last 4 or 5 months has really brought home to people how important it is to stay engaged with what's going on in the market, watch very carefully what's happening to your positions, and think very hard about how you manage your exposure to that volatility. So the greater awareness, the greater planning, the greater emphasis on long-term planning are all good things. And apart from that, I think the energy has a new respect for conservation. And I don't mean that in a cliched way. I think if you look at companies like Chevron and Shell and BP, even ExxonMobil, their access to reserves, their access to free markets has greatly diminished in the last 10 years. In the last 5 years in particular, those companies are now talking about energy conservation and alternative energy in a way that is far more serious than they ever did before we went through this cycle.
Thank you for this interview.
All right, my pleasure. Thanks.